The reading for this morning is taken from the 7th chapter of Mark's Gospel, a selection of verses between 1 and 23. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked Jesus, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." The word of the Lord. When I was growing up, I went to an academic high school in Philadelphia that drew students from all over the city. Central High was unusual for a public school because it had only boys. Girls High was down the street a few blocks. Due to its academic focus, many of my fellow classmates were Jewish. And I really liked the Jewish High Holy Days because there were so few of us present on those days that we weren't able to do the usual coursework, and it was kind of like a holiday at school. I discovered early on the differences among the various modern strands of Judaism: Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. Actually, there weren't very many Orthodox students at all at that school, because the Orthodox rarely attend public schools because they'd have to associate with Goyim, Gentiles like me. But we did have a lot of conservative Jews as well as Reform Jews. Both Orthodox and conservative Jews strictly follow the religious laws of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, what we know as Genesis through Deuteronomy. Torah means law, and often when you hear law mentioned in the New Testament, the writers are speaking of that Torah indeed. Some of my conservative Jewish friends took the ban on saying the divine name so literally that when it came to writing God, they would write G-D. They also took the prohibition from Exodus, I think it's Exodus 23:19, that says, "You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk." So in the Jewish households, a traditional Jewish household, you will have 2 sets of pots, dishes, pans, serving utensils, and everything else, one for meat and one for other kinds of food. I know that more than one Jewish family that decided to become vegetarian in order to make it easier to stay kosher. So that's the background that I bring to the gospel reading from this morning. And for one thing, I know right away that this reading has nothing to do with cleanliness of food, that is physical cleanliness, but it has everything to do with ritual cleanliness, what we might call spiritual cleanliness. It wasn't a matter of washing dirt or bacteria off the food. Nobody knew anything about bacteria. Nobody was washing with soap for 20 seconds to be sure that they got rid of the coronavirus. Instead, the focus was on the ritual cleanliness, as I said, almost spiritual cleanliness. Some of Jesus' disciples ignored all of those rituals, and that really offended the religious authorities. They weren't living according to the tradition of the elders. Well, Jesus responded by quoting the tradition of the elders to show that the religious leadership had been hypocrites for a very long time, at least back to the time of Isaiah. With their lips they quoted the tradition, but in their hearts they spurned the commandments of God. Jesus provided some very specific examples of that, omitted in today's reading, possibly because they are obscure to modern ears. But Jesus' point remains, however. How one acts makes one spiritually unclean, not what one eats. And the reason for that, Jesus said, is that our actions originate in the heart, in what we truly believe. He provided a long list of evils that come from the heart, perhaps because he was surrounded by people who showed those evils, especially the religious authorities. St. Paul has a more positive list in his letter to the Galatians, one that I appreciate more than Jesus' negative list. Paul calls them the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. For those of us who think of ourselves as religious, today's gospel reading should be a caution. Being true to God's call is not synonymous with religious observance. Following the rules is not the path to salvation. Following Jesus is. And whether we're truly following Jesus is shown by how we act, because that reveals what is in our hearts. Once more, I'm reminded of that wonderful remark of St. Teresa of Avila, who said that it's hard to tell if you're growing in love of God, but it's really easy to tell if you're growing in love of your neighbor. How we treat one another reveals what's in our hearts. For me, high school was a long time ago, yet I still feel the influence of my Jewish friends, especially when the divine name occasionally shows up in a psalm or a canticle. I always substitute Adonai, meaning Lord, for the divine name that is actually printed there. It's just what my Jewish friends did and still do whenever they read the Hebrew Scriptures. I find it curious that the vowels of Adonai combined with the consonants of the unpronounceable divine name is what created Jehovah in the King James Bible, a name by which God was never called in ancient Israel or anywhere else. Well, I may use Adonai, but like other Christians, of course, I don't follow the Jewish kosher food laws. What I eat does not make me unclean. What comes out of my mouth, however, that's something I still have to pay attention to, for that tells me what is really in my heart. Amen.